it's become really overdone. Fair enough, if you go to an Indigenous institution or an Indigenous community, by all means let's have a welcome, in the same way that if you turn up at a school, the principal will say, well, welcome to the school. But this idea that at the opening of an envelope there's got to be an acknowledgement of country, I just think is it's dead wrong.
2025 is a year of change. Cultural and political disruption is transforming our nation and the global order. The rebellion against the establishment has accelerated. Australia and the Western Alliance is now at a crossroads. Either the mainstream will continue its ascendancy or the elites will prevail. Hello Tony, and g'day to all of our viewers and listeners. Great to be back. Today we'll be talking about Iran, Australia's alliance with the US, and the latest developments in Victoria with the push for a voice to Parliament and issues pertaining to welcome and acknowledgement of countries. Tony, great to be back with you.
And likewise, Dan.
All right, Tony, well, let's start with a discussion about Iran and the Middle East and the United States taking out or seriously setting back Iran's nuclear capabilities and facilities. There appears to be somewhat of a ceasefire or a temporary truce in place in the Middle East. There's questions about how long that will last. But just interested in your assessment of the strategic situation that's unfolding in the Middle East.
Well, Dan, last time we spoke, we talked a little bit about whether the United States would assist Israel in trying to eliminate an Iranian nuclear weapon. I think we may have been a little sceptical as to whether the Donald would actually do this, given everything he said about ending so-called forever wars. I say good on Donald Trump for taking this step. Obviously, the Americans had been planning to do something like this for quite some time, given just how well they pulled it off. The big question is, has the Iranian nuclear weapons program been completely destroyed, or has it merely been set back? We've got to hope that it's the former, and frankly, if it ever does come back, I hope both Israel and the United States, if needs be assisted by our other allies, including Australia, will do exactly the same thing again. Because one thing has got to be absolutely crystal clear. An apocalyptic Islamist regime committed to the destruction of Israel, to the establishment of a global caliphate, such a regime can never, ever be permitted to get a nuclear weapon, because if it does ever get a nuclear weapon, literally mayhem will be unleashed, and no one can be in any way relaxed about that.
So there has been a temporary ceasefire of sorts. How confident are you that that will hold? And what do you think needs to happen if either Israel or Iran breaks that ceasefire?
The important thing, Dan, is not to have a ceasefire. The important thing is to have a lasting peace. And the only lasting peace that you can have is with an Iran which has effectively given up its complete obsession with destroying Israel, its complete obsession with establishing a global caliphate. Now, no one is explicitly talking about regime change, because it's very difficult for regime change to be forced from the outside. In the end, the government of Iran has to be something which is chosen by the Iranian people. But it's pretty obvious that there can be no lasting peace with Iran until it gives up those objectives. And I think people have to be very clear about that. And I think it's incumbent upon Australia not to sit on the sidelines, not to constantly call for de-escalation and diplomacy, but to be very supportive of our fellow liberal democracies. Israel, as the only liberal democracy in the Middle East, and the United States, as the leader of the free world. I think it's incumbent upon us to be very supportive of Israel and America in their attempts to ensure that there is no way on God's earth that Iran can ever have a nuclear weapon.
And where does this leave the alliance that Australia has with the US? It took our government some time to back the strikes that the US undertook. We know that Albanese has had a hard time having a meeting with President Donald Trump. Where does this leave us, and what should our government be doing?
I regret to say this, Dan, but I think that the Australia-US alliance, the security partnership, which has been our most important relationship for these last 70 years, a security partnership which has been quite important for the wider world, I think it's at grave risk, because it's pretty clear that a transactional administration is going to expect a lot more of its allies than we seem willing to give. We've recently seen Donald Trump at NATO demanding and getting an increase in NATO defence spending to 3.5% for the immediate military needs of the nation, and to 5% when you throw in other security issues. Now, I think it'd be fair to say that none of the NATO countries, with the possible exception of the Balts and Poland, the partial exception of Britain, none of the NATO countries really wanted to volunteer this, but they understandably felt that they had absolutely no choice if America was to remain fully committed to NATO, including the Article 5 one-in, all-in provision that would bring in the United States if there was an armed attack on any of the NATO members. So the America's European NATO allies have got the message from Washington that if you want American help, you've got to help yourself. And you can't ask America to do more for your defence than you are prepared to do for your defence. Now, the one place that doesn't seem to have got the message is Canberra, because our Prime Minister is absolutely stubborn and obdurate in his insistence that we're already doing more than enough, that a glacial increase in our defence spending from 2 to 2.3% over a decade is somehow enough, that the other things we do for America, like host a few Marines in Darwin and host the Pine Gap Space Facility near Alice Springs, possibly produce a few strategic minerals down the track, that's all enough. Well, I don't think this is going to cut much mustard in Washington. I think that the reason why the Prime Minister seems nervous and anxious about having a sit-down in the Oval Office with the President is because he doesn't want to go in there and cop a Zelensky-style bollocking, and yet I suppose that's almost inevitably what he's going to get, unless he can go in there, like Keir Starmer did, with a substantial increase in military spending on the table. So I don't imagine that there will be a formal rupture in the alliance, but I do think that it's at risk of becoming almost a dead letter. And I certainly think that an administration which is hard-pressed to provide for its own submarine needs is going to be pretty reluctant to offer Australia 3 Virginia-class nuclear submarines in 7 years' time if it doesn't feel Australia is 110% on America's side. In retrospect, clearly, perhaps the biggest single mistake in the security space that the Albanese government has made was declining a request to send a frigate to the Red Sea. This is the first time since ANZUS in 1951 that Australia has declined a direct American request for military assistance. And while it was basically just political static here, I think that was seismic in Washington.
What's your advice to Anthony Albanese? Because you dealt with a US president who was on the opposite side of politics in Barack Obama, and you did that, very well. Obviously, Donald Trump is diametrically opposed to Anthony Albanese in his politics and his world outlook. What's your advice to Anthony Albanese in terms of how he, as Prime Minister, should deal with a US president whose politics, domestic politics at least, doesn't align with his own?
Well, it's a bit of a problem. I mean, even though Barack Obama was no political soulmate of mine, he was at the same time conscious of America's global responsibilities. And so when I went into the Oval Office and said, look, Mr. President, I'm not here to complain, I'm not here to demand, I'm here to give, I'm here to offer. When I said to him that, look, Australia may not be America's strongest or most important ally, but we intend to be your most dependable and reliable ally, I think he was actually quite gratified. So in that respect, at least, I think Obama was happy with Australia and perhaps even to some extent with me. It's harder for Anthony Albanese to go in there because what Donald Trump wants is not something that he's readily prepared to give. But I just think the importance of the US alliance is such that we simply have to do more to preserve it. I mean, the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister are constantly saying correctly that these are the most dangerous strategic times since the late 1930s. Now, unfortunately, the deeds don't match the words. We aren't building up our defences. We aren't stockpiling the munitions and the other materials that we would need in a national security crisis. And yet we have to be ready to do a lot more to safeguard ourselves and to protect the peace in our region at very short notice. At very short notice. I mean, Ukraine had perhaps a 3 months warning of the crisis on their borders. Israel had no warning whatsoever of October 7. So we have to be ready to protect ourselves and contribute to the defence of our allies really at a moment's notice, and we're not ready. I mean, what people don't understand is that we actually spend more in absolute financial terms on our military than Israel spends on its. Yet could our military do a fraction of what Israel's can? So yes, we've got to spend a lot more, but more importantly, we've got to get much better value for the dollar, and we've got to have armed forces with much greater real capabilities than ours currently have. I mean, we have no missile defences to speak of. We have no offensive missiles to speak of. We have almost no drone capability. We have almost no underwater drone capability. We don't have stockpiles of the basic necessities of munitions. We don't have fuel storage here on shore. We've been talking about producing missiles in this country for several years now. Absolutely nothing has happened other than talk. So this is it's certainly culpable. It's really almost criminal, the neglect of our defences. And okay, the current government is not the only government that has contributed to this. Regrettably, more should have been done by the previous coalition government as well, because we've been aware for a long time now of just how things were sliding geopolitically around the world. So Anthony Albanese needs to somehow put his green left instincts to one side and do what has to be done for the sake of the nation if the American alliance is to be preserved and if our global and national security is to be safeguarded.
Well, speaking of green left instincts, there's no better demonstration of where that leads than here in Victoria, Tony. And I wanted to get your observations on the latest developments, because it's not just relevant to Victoria, but relevant to Australia and what happens when you have a radical government that is unchained in the absence really of an effective opposition and what they might do. And we've had the Yoorrook Commission deliver its report and recommendations, which was just released recently. It's extraordinary in how radical and extreme it is. It calls for, among other matters, the establishment of a permanent Indigenous-only voice to Parliament, reparations payments, the exemption of Indigenous Australians from the payment of certain taxes, more land to be locked up purely for the use of Indigenous Victorians and nobody else. It is really a doctrine for permanent and extreme political and legal separatism and the establishment of a two-tiered society. In Victoria, no doubt that will be used as a boilerplate federally if it is successful, at least in a legislative sense. I'm interested in your thoughts on this, particularly in the context of the large no vote that took place to the federal voice referendum.
The first point to be made, Dan, is that all of this would just be fundamentally unfair, because it would be giving one group of people a whole lot of rights and privileges that are not enjoyed by every Victorian. And frankly, this was the problem with the voice. Even though the voice was not, at least ostensibly, about reparations and special payments, it certainly was about giving some people more say, more rights effectively than others. And it's precisely because the Australian people believe in equality before the law, not inequality before the law, that we voted overwhelmingly, Victorians included, against the voice. But typical of the Green left elites, democracy is something that they only respect if it goes their way. Having been resoundingly rebuffed here, they're effectively just pushing on regardless. And we had the Albanese government claim to accept the voice result, but at the same time we've got treaty, we've got so-called truth-telling, which is still funded in the Albanese government's budget. We've got the Labor states all pushing in this direction. And yes, what's happening here in Victoria with moves toward a treaty, with claims for reparations, with the entrenchment of an Indigenous voice, notwithstanding the people's say in all of this, is typical of the Green left. And this is a real opening for the Liberal Party here in Victoria if they're prepared to take it. But they've got to make it absolutely crystal clear that as far as they're concerned, not only is this wrong, but if it were to happen, it will be instantly reversed by any incoming Liberal national government.
Yeah, I think the Liberals have said that they'll get rid of any voice that is put in should they get elected, which is a good start. I mean, what does this sort of tell us about the direction of the political class in Australia? I mean, they, as you say, they not only listen to the vote that they like, they'll ignore anything else, but isn't it also the case that they're so now fundamentally unmoored from the mainstream of society that it's no wonder that more and more Victorians in Australia no longer believe that the political system works in their interest? I mean, you vote at the voice, you vote no, and you get it anyway, and you go, well, what's the point of the system?
Look, that's right, Dan. I mean, for democracy to be meaningful, your vote has got to mean something. And at the moment, yes, we all voted against the voice by heavy majority, and yet governments, state and federal, appear to be pushing on regardless. So look, it is a huge problem, and over time, it's the kind of thing that does breed cynicism about the system, weakens trust in government, breaks down the bonds of society. It absolutely does all these things. And I suppose at heart, there are radical Indigenous activists that are trying to undo 200 years of history and kind of retrospectively refit modern Australia as some kind of series of Indigenous nations that are co-equal with state and federal governments. So there's this push to undo history on the part of Indigenous activists, and there's this, I guess, guilt on the part of the mainstream Green left at what happened from 1788 and subsequently. Now, we all accept that there were all sorts of misunderstandings, injustices, even occasionally atrocities in the wake of the British settlement of Australia. but fundamentally the British settlement of Australia has been a very good thing indeed. But for the British settlement of Australia from 1788 on, the people of this continent would still be living in a Hobbesian state of nature. Sure, there were a number of terrible atrocities committed by settlers against the first Australians. But, you know, Aboriginal society pre-settlement was hardly some kind of Garden of Eden. It was hardly some kind of prelapsarian bliss. If you read the accounts of people like Buckley, the convict who lived with Aboriginal people for some 30 years here in Victoria, it was basically the war of all against all. Certainly there was a massive amount of both intra-clan and inter-clan violence on a huge scale. So we've just got to understand that first, you can't undo the past. You can't and shouldn't try to rewrite history. And second, we've all got to go forward together. We are one country. We all have equal citizenship. And when it comes to handouts from government, these should always be on the basis of need, not on the basis of ancestry or ethnicity.
And a related topic that's come up again recently is on welcome to country and acknowledgement of countries. And we released a survey recently that showed 56% of Australians believe that the practice has become divisive. Only 17% disagreed and the remainder were unsure. And just 1/3 thought that welcome to country should be performed at major events like sporting events or Anzac Day ceremonies. So clearly the mob is over it. And I think it's an example of, you know, I find it aggressive the way it is now. It started off as something that was meant to be kind of polite and genteel, and it's become, you know, multiple times a day, every day for years on end, we're inundated with a welcome to our own country. And it's hard to think of anything that could be more aggressive or divisive than that.
It's almost become a form of harassment. It's almost become a form of putting people in their place and making non-Indigenous Australians or Australians with no element of Aboriginal ancestry feel like they are effectively interlopers in their own land. So, look, I agree with you, Dan. I think it's become really overdone. Fair enough, if you go to an Indigenous institution or an Indigenous community, by all means, let's have a welcome, in the same way that if you turn up at a school, the principal will say, well, welcome to the school. If you turn up at someone else's home, normally at the door, you'll be told how pleased we are to see you and how welcome you are. But this idea that at the opening of an envelope, there's got to be an acknowledgement of country, I just think it's dead wrong. It is definitely divisive. It's minatory in its intent half the time. It's often not delivered in a particularly friendly spirit. There's so much that's wrong with this. Ditto the practice of flying 3 flags constantly, as if the flag of all of us should simply be there with the flags of some of us. It's so wrong, and we need to stop these practices, and the sooner the better.
You've spent a lot of time in Indigenous, remote Indigenous communities in East Arnhem Land, for example, and you made a point of, even when you were Prime Minister, I think it was spending 1 week per year in one of these communities. What is the sort of the reception of those who live in remote Indigenous communities toward these, what are basically inner city urban practices? Are they even aware that this takes place? How is it perceived in the communities that these practices are purported to represent?
That's a very good question, Dan. And look, I don't claim to be exhaustively across the mood in every remote Indigenous settlement. I think there's a degree of bemusement. I think there's a large measure of ignorance about exactly what's going on. I certainly think there's a pretty big gulf between the activists who like to feed into this sense of grievance and victimhood and the attitude of just normal, everyday Australians who happen to be Indigenous, regardless of where they're living, but particularly in remote communities where essentially it's a question of just living every day as it comes and trying to make the most of every day. I think if you're in remote Indigenous Australia, your concerns are, is the school functioning? Is the clinic functioning? If things go wrong, are there police on hand to help? Am I not going to be humbugged of my money by relatives who maybe want to waste it on the wrong things? I think the average everyday Aboriginal Australian just wants to get on with life and get on with everyone else as best he or she can. So I think this is far removed from their concerns. I tried to make it my business throughout my time in public life to spend serious time every year in remote Australia because I accept that in terms of the normal indicators, life in remote Australia doesn't measure up to life in the rest of the place. I mean, unemployment rates, education rates, life expectancies are generally much lower in remote Australia than in urban and regional Australia. Obviously, that impacts very heavily on Aboriginal people, and rather than simply look at the reports and I guess talk to so-called experts, I think it was important to actually show solidarity with the people of remote Australia by going out there and spending serious time there. And I regret the fact that no subsequent Prime Minister has chosen to do that. But my interest in remote Australia comes from my desire to be as helpful as I humanly can to my fellow Australians, not because I want to see separatism, not because I want to feed into a sense of victimhood, which is ultimately so utterly corrosive of the good life for anyone who falls into that trap.
Well, Tony, I think that's a great note to end on for today. So thank you again for sharing your insights with us, and we'll catch up in about a fortnight's time.
I certainly hope so, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.